What It Means to Be Wise as a Serpent by Dag Heward-Mills. Few Christian books unsettle comfortable assumptions about goodness as deliberately as What It Means to Be Wise as a Serpent. Dag Heward-Mills writes with urgent realism to argue that innocence without wisdom is not virtue, but vulnerability. In What It Means to Be Wise as a Serpent, Dag Heward-Mills explores Jesus' paradoxical instruction that believers must be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. The book contends that many Christians fail not because of moral compromise, but because of naivete, misjudgment, and lack of discernment. Heward-Mills argues that spiritual sincerity alone is insufficient in a world shaped by power, deception, and human ambition. Drawing from scripture, pastoral experience, and leadership failures, he reframes wisdom as survival intelligence rather than manipulation. The book insists that goodness must be protected by alertness. Heward-Mills challenges the assumption that spiritual leaders will be treated fairly or understood correctly. He emphasizes foresight, caution, and strategic thinking as biblical virtues. Throughout the book, wisdom is contrasted with foolish openness and misplaced trust. Biblical figures are used as case studies rather than moral ornaments. The tone is corrective, occasionally confrontational, but consistently pastoral. Heward-Mills does not advocate cynicism, but sobriety. The argument unfolds as a manual for longevity rather than heroism. Ultimately, the thesis is that discernment is not optional for Christian survival. To ignore this truth, the author warns, is to confuse purity with passivity. Chapter 1. Be Wise as a Serpent. The opening chapter establishes the governing metaphor of the book. Heward-Mills examines Jesus' instruction in Matthew 10:16 and argues that wisdom is not opposed to righteousness. He introduces the serpent not as a symbol of evil, but of alertness, self-preservation, and awareness of danger. The chapter challenges readers to reconsider sentimental readings of Christianity that equate holiness with ignorance. Heward-Mills stresses that Jesus himself acknowledged danger and instructed his disciples accordingly. The chapter sets a confrontational but necessary tone, insisting that survival is a spiritual responsibility. Wisdom, he argues, is an act of obedience, not compromise. Chapter 2. The Dangers of Being Naive. This chapter focuses on the cost of innocence without discernment. Heward-Mills argues that many spiritual casualties result from trusting too easily, speaking too freely, and assuming goodwill where none exists. He presents naivete as a moral failure rather than a virtue. Drawing from pastoral observation, he explains how leaders and believers are often harmed by predictable patterns of betrayal. The chapter reframes caution as stewardship. Heward-Mills emphasizes that being loving does not require being exposed. Wisdom, he insists, includes learning when not to reveal everything. Chapter 3. The World is Not Innocent. Here Heward-Mills broadens the scope from individual error to structural reality. He argues that the world operates on power dynamics, competition, and self-interest, even within religious contexts. The chapter dismantles the assumption that shared faith guarantees shared integrity. Heward-Mills warns that spiritual language can mask harmful intent. He urges readers to observe behavior rather than trust rhetoric. This chapter lays the groundwork for later discussions on leadership, betrayal, and survival. Wisdom is framed as realism grounded in biblical anthropology. Chapter 4. Evil is Real. In this chapter, Heward-Mills confronts the tendency to minimize or spiritualize away evil. He argues that denial of evil leads to unpreparedness. Evil, he insists, is active, intentional, and strategic. The chapter draws from biblical narratives to show how harm often comes through familiar channels. Heward-Mills does not dwell on fear, but on awareness. By naming evil plainly, he believes believers regain agency. Wisdom begins, he suggests, by acknowledging threat without panic. Chapter 5. Be Careful Whom You Trust. Trust becomes the focus of this chapter. Heward-Mills distinguishes between Christian love and unrestricted confidence. He argues that trust must be earned and maintained, not assumed. Using relational examples, he demonstrates how misplaced trust leads to preventable harm. The chapter encourages measured disclosure and discernment in relationships. Heward-Mills frames trust as a valuable currency that must be spent wisely. Love, he insists, does not require indiscriminate vulnerability. Chapter 6. The Danger of Familiarity. This chapter examines how closeness can breed contempt or exploitation. Heward-Mills warns that proximity often erodes respect and invites manipulation. He argues that wisdom sometimes requires distance, boundaries, and formality. Familiarity is presented as a double-edged sword that must be managed carefully. The chapter challenges romantic notions of openness in leadership. Wisdom, here, is the ability to maintain healthy distance without emotional coldness. Chapter 7. Protect yourself. Self-preservation emerges as a legitimate spiritual concern. Heward-Mills argues against the belief that self-protection is selfish. He frames protection as responsibility, especially for leaders whose collapse affects others. The chapter discusses guarding reputation, health, and emotional reserves. Wisdom is defined as proactive defense rather than reactive repair. The chapter's tone is pragmatic, emphasizing foresight over heroics. Chapter 8. Do not reveal everything. This chapter focuses on discretion. Heward-Mills argues that silence is often wiser than transparency. He emphasizes that information, once shared, cannot be retrieved. The chapter challenges confessional cultures that equate openness with authenticity. Wisdom is portrayed as selective disclosure guided by purpose rather than impulse. The chapter encourages strategic communication rooted in discernment. Chapter 9. Avoid unnecessary exposure. Exposure is framed as a risk factor rather than a virtue. Heward-Mills explains how public visibility increases vulnerability to attack, misunderstanding, and exploitation. He argues that some battles are avoided simply by remaining unseen. The chapter urges readers to evaluate when visibility serves mission and when it invites harm. Wisdom is defined as the ability to remain effective without being conspicuous. Chapter 10. Be careful what you say. Speech becomes the focus of this chapter. Heward-Mills emphasizes that words create permanent consequences. He warns against emotional speech, impulsive honesty, and unguarded commentary. The chapter highlights silence as an underrated discipline. Wisdom is framed as verbal restraint informed by foresight. Speaking less, he argues, often protects more. Chapter 11. Learn to read people. Discernment of character is presented as essential wisdom. Heward-Mills argues that patterns of behavior reveal more than stated intentions. He encourages observation over assumption. The chapter offers practical insight into recognizing warning signs. Wisdom is portrayed as attentiveness sharpened by experience. This chapter reinforces the book's emphasis on realism. Chapter 12. Anticipate betrayal. Betrayal is addressed not as paranoia but as probability. Heward-Mills argues that expecting loyalty without safeguards is irresponsible. He draws from biblical narratives to show betrayal as a recurring human pattern. The chapter encourages emotional preparedness rather than bitterness. Wisdom, here, is anticipation without cynicism. Chapter 13. Accept the reality of enemies. In this chapter, Heward-Mills confronts a deeply uncomfortable truth for many believers: enemies are not hypothetical. He argues that refusal to acknowledge opposition leaves Christians defenseless. Drawing from scripture and leadership experience, he explains that opposition often arises precisely because of influence or calling. The chapter discourages both denial and obsession, advocating sober acknowledgement instead. Wisdom, here, is the capacity to function effectively despite hostility. Heward-Mills emphasizes preparedness over paranoia, insisting that recognizing enemies is a form of maturity, not bitterness. Chapter 14. Learn how to escape. Escape is framed as strategy rather than cowardice. Heward-Mills challenges heroic narratives that glorify endurance at all costs. He argues that Jesus himself withdrew strategically when danger intensified. The chapter emphasizes discernment in knowing when to stay and when to leave. Wisdom is portrayed as flexibility rather than stubbornness. By presenting escape as obedience rather than failure, Heward-Mills reframes retreat as preservation of future usefulness. Chapter 15. Avoid dangerous associations. This chapter examines relational proximity and influence. Heward-Mills argues that associations shape destiny more than intentions. He warns that spiritual language does not neutralize destructive relationships. The chapter encourages deliberate relational boundaries, particularly for leaders. Wisdom is framed as selective companionship. Heward-Mills insists that holiness includes choosing environments that sustain rather than erode spiritual clarity. Chapter 16. Control your emotions. Emotional regulation becomes the focus here. Heward-Mills argues that uncontrolled emotion undermines wisdom, particularly in leadership. He emphasizes that emotional expression should be governed by discernment rather than impulse. The chapter discusses how anger, fear, and excitement can cloud judgment. Wisdom is portrayed as mastery of internal reactions. Emotional restraint, he argues, protects credibility and longevity. Chapter 17, Learn to be silent. Silence is elevated from absence of speech to active discipline. Heward-Mills argues that many crises escalate unnecessarily through speech. He presents silence as a form of strength rather than weakness. The chapter encourages strategic quietness in moments of conflict or provocation. Wisdom is framed as knowing when words will harm rather than heal. This chapter deepens the book's emphasis on restraint. Chapter 18, Know when to speak. Balancing the previous chapter, Heward-Mills addresses the necessity of timely speech. Wisdom, he argues, is not perpetual silence but accurate timing. The chapter explores discernment in addressing issues before they harden into crises. Heward-Mills emphasizes courage guided by wisdom. Speech becomes effective when aligned with purpose rather than emotion. The chapter reinforces balance as a recurring theme. Chapter 19, Learn to disappear. Here Heward-Mills introduces the counterintuitive idea that visibility is not always advantageous. He argues that strategic withdrawal can preserve influence and safety. The chapter challenges modern assumptions equating visibility with success. Wisdom is framed as knowing when absence protects mission. Heward-Mills presents disappearance as temporary repositioning rather than abandonment. Chapter 20, Protect the Work. This chapter shifts focus from individual survival to institutional preservation. Heward-Mills emphasizes that ministries and missions require safeguarding beyond personal integrity. He discusses systems, delegation, and boundaries as protective measures. Wisdom is presented as organizational foresight. The chapter underscores responsibility toward those who depend on the work's continuity. Chapter 21, Think Long-Term. Longevity becomes the central concern. Heward-Mills contrasts short-term victories with sustained effectiveness. He argues that wisdom evaluates consequences across years, not moments. The chapter encourages patience, planning, and delayed gratification. Wisdom is framed as future-oriented judgment. The emphasis aligns with the book's recurring concern for survival over spectacle. Chapter 22, Combine Wisdom with Innocence. Returning to Jesus' original instruction, Heward-Mills synthesizes the book's themes. Wisdom, he insists, must coexist with moral innocence. The chapter guards against cynicism by reasserting purity of motive. Wisdom without innocence becomes manipulation. Innocence without wisdom becomes vulnerability. The chapter functions as ethical integration rather than conclusion. Chapter 23, Living as a Wise Believer. The final chapter offers a holistic vision of Christian life shaped by discernment. Heward-Mills integrates wisdom into daily decision-making, leadership, relationships, and ministry. The tone is reflective rather than urgent. The book closes by reaffirming that wisdom is learnable and necessary. The chapter leaves readers with responsibility rather than fear. Dag Heward-Mills structures what it means to be wise as a serpent less as a linear argument and more as an accumulative training manual. Each chapter isolates a single aspect of wisdom: silence, distance, caution, anticipation, and treats it independently, yet the repetition of tone and concern creates a compounding effect. The book is deliberately modular. Chapters can be read out of sequence, but together they build a worldview. This pedagogical choice mirrors the author's aim. Wisdom, as Heward-Mills presents it, is not acquired through one decisive insight but through repeated exposure to uncomfortable truths. The structure reinforces this by returning again and again to restraint, foresight, and realism. Rather than crescendoing toward a dramatic climax, the book advances through steady pressure, reshaping assumptions incrementally. Although the book contains no narrative characters, it is deeply concerned with character formation. Heward-Mills treats the reader as the subject being shaped. Over the course of the chapters, the implied reader moves from innocence toward discernment, from openness toward measured engagement. This developmental arc substitutes for traditional character development. The repeated warnings against speech, exposure, and misplaced trust gradually construct an image of a wise believer: observant, reserved, emotionally regulated, and future-oriented. The transformation is ethical rather than emotional. By the final chapters, wisdom has become not a tactic but a temperament. The dominant theme of the book is survival without cynicism. Heward-Mills insists that Christian life unfolds in contested spaces, where intentions collide with power and ambition. Wisdom is presented as the capacity to remain righteous without becoming naive. Closely related is the theme of restraint of speech, visibility, association, and reaction. Another recurring theme is longevity. The author consistently privileges sustainability over short-term heroism. Innocence appears not as ignorance, but as moral clarity guarded by wisdom. Together, these themes form a theology of sober engagement with reality. The author consistently privileges sustainability over short-term heroism. Innocence appears not as ignorance, but as moral clarity guarded by wisdom. Together, these themes form a theology of sober engagement with reality. Such statements function as aphorisms, designed for memorability. The repetition of warnings may feel excessive to some readers, but it aligns with the author's didactic intent. He writes not to persuade skeptics through nuance, but to reprogram assumptions through insistence. The pacing of the book is steady and deliberate. Chapters are brief and focused, preventing fatigue while allowing accumulation. Repetition is not accidental but formative. By revisiting similar cautions across different contexts, speech, trust, visibility, Heward-Mills ingrains a single lesson from multiple angles. This method resembles oral teaching traditions more than academic argumentation. The reader is trained through recurrence rather than novelty. While the book's themes are not unprecedented, its tone is distinctive within Christian literature. Heward-Mills unapologetically challenges sentimental spirituality. Unlike many leadership texts that emphasize charisma or optimism, this book emphasizes restraint and caution. Its originality lies in its refusal to soften its realism for comfort. By centering wisdom as survival intelligence, the book occupies a rare space between pastoral care and strategic counsel. Heward-Mills's arguments rely on compressed, aphoristic statements designed to recalibrate instinctive responses. Early in the book, he states wisdom is protection. Innocence without wisdom is exposure. This pairing encapsulates the book's core thesis: moral purity does not negate risk. Elsewhere, his insistence that silence is often the highest form of wisdom reframes restraint as strength rather than fear. Such lines are not ornamental, they function as demonic anchors, meant to be recalled under pressure. When he warns visibility attracts both helpers and destroyers, he distills an entire chapter's argument into a single cautionary principle. The effectiveness of these quotations lies in their portability. They can be carried into decision-making contexts without explanatory scaffolding. Another representative statement reads, "You do not escape danger by being good. You escape danger by being wise." This line exemplifies the book's confrontational realism. It unsettles readers who equate morality with immunity, yet it aligns closely with the author's pastoral experience. These quotations, always brief and declarative, reveal a rhetorical strategy aimed at behavioral change rather than contemplative reflection. This book will resonate strongly with Christian leaders, pastors, and organizational heads who have experienced betrayal, misunderstanding, or burnout. Readers who operate in public-facing or influence-bearing roles will recognize the patterns Heward-Mills describes. The book is particularly valuable for younger leaders whose formation emphasizes zeal over discernment. It will also appeal to pragmatic readers who prefer actionable counsel to abstract theology. Conversely, readers drawn to devotional literature emphasizing vulnerability, transparency, and emotional openness may find the tone unsettling. Those uncomfortable with power analysis or strategic thinking in spiritual contexts may resist its conclusions. However, even resistant readers may find the book clarifying, if challenging. Its value lies precisely in its refusal to flatter idealism. Heward-Mills's work invites comparison with John Maxwell's leadership literature, particularly in its concern for longevity and influence. However, where Maxwell emphasizes inspiration and relational optimism, Heward-Mills foregrounds caution and defense. A closer theological parallel can be found in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's reflections on costly discipleship, though Bonhoeffer's focus is moral courage under persecution, while Heward-Mills emphasizes survival amid internal and relational threats. Unlike popular leadership texts that celebrate visibility and charisma, What It Means to Be Wise as a Serpent advocates strategic obscurity and restraint. marking a clear divergence from mainstream Christian leadership narratives. What It Means to Be Wise as a Serpent is a demanding but necessary book. It offers no sentimentality, only preparation. Dag Heward-Mills writes for readers willing to exchange comforting illusions for durable wisdom. The book's strength lies in its realism, its pastoral urgency, and its insistence that goodness must be guarded. While its repetition may frustrate readers seeking nuance, it serves a formative purpose. For leaders, ministers, and serious believers concerned with longevity, discernment, and integrity, this book is not merely recommended, it is corrective. Read slowly, apply cautiously, and return to it when idealism collides with reality.